What do you do when you're faced with a major issue? Major issue. Do you go what a lot of people do, which is just panic? Do you go into denial? I can't deal with it. It's not happening. Do you go into meltdown and just the wheels come off? Do you go into overdrive? Right, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to throw everything I've got at it. Roger Burns, you're nodding away there. Roger goes into overdrive. But sometimes we can all do that. How about do we stop and pray? Do you know, a survey was done in the UK 2018, so it's a little bit older now. 51% of adults reported praying. That's quite a lot, isn't it? 51. And apparently about half of those pray because of a crisis. Now, as you know, this week is the 80th anniversary of VE Day. And as we think about wars and conflicts, I think there was that phrase, I guess, from the First World War, there's no atheists in the trenches. You know that? There's no atheists in the trenches. When you see the horror that goes on, and it causes you to think all sorts of things, there's very, very few soldiers would have gone there. I don't know. There would be people praying and crying out. So today, as I said, we're looking at this new series on Nehemiah, because here was a guy who was facing a crisis. And you might be thinking, well, my first crisis is, I don't know who Nehemiah is. Who is this guy? What's it about? Let's get up to speed with Nehemiah. Because initially, it sounds like a really dull book. Okay, the summary of Nehemiah is a government official becomes a builder. Okay, and that's the summary of the book. And you think, how dull is that? You know, a civil servant picks up a trowel. Come on, tell me something more interesting than that. Well, we'll see that it is far more involved than that. And to help us to get on the page, I want us to zoom out and to look at the big picture of the Old Testament. Where does this actually fit in? Because if we go way right back to Genesis 1, God makes the world. Genesis 1 and 2, and it's good and it's perfect. Genesis 3, people rebel, and there's this sin enters the world. And people are all messed up, and the world is not going well at all. And God says to a group of people, the people of Israel, he says, I'm going to set my love on you, because I want you to be like a little, do you know what a petri dish is? Like an example, a little thing. You live like this so that you can be a representative to the rest of the world. Okay? And he said, I didn't pick you. You can read this in Deuteronomy. He says, I didn't pick you because you're the brightest and the best. Far from it. I picked you because you're the smallest and the least, really. So I can show my power through you. And God, then if we read that, we see that the people were taken captive and they were in Egypt, and God rescued them out of Egypt. Okay, and we might have a look at that in the coming months. And God gave the people good rules to live by. You may have heard of the Ten Commandments. And God, the preface of the Ten Commandments is, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. So live like this. What a loving thing to do, rather than just say, do what you like. He said, this is the way to do it. This is the rules for life. But the people did not obey. And God says, if you don't obey this, then there'll be consequences. Things will happen. And actually what we saw is that they were overcome by the superpowers of the day. So in about 722 BC, so a little bit beyond last weekend, a long time back, the northern half of the kingdom of Israel were chucked out by the then superpower, the Assyrians. And they were exiled, which means chucked out of their own land. And they never came back. And then a similar thing happened with the Babylonian Empire. You may have heard of the Babylonians, Hanging Gardens of Babylon, all that stuff, in about 500 BC. And so with this loss, there's a loss of land, there's the whole trauma of moving, so going from where Israel is probably somewhere over towards Iraq kind of way, if we look on a map today. And not only were people, there was all the trauma of that, but also if God was saying, this is my presence with you here, it's like they're being taken away from God's presence, figuratively speaking. So it was all very traumatic. So in this time, Nehemiah is this guy who has been born and raised as a part of the people of Israel, but in a different land. And if you look at the last verse here in Nehemiah chapter 1 that Matthew read to us, what was his job? He worked in the government. He was cupbearer to the king. What does a cupbearer to the king do? He tastes the wine to check that it's not poisoned. I guess he got through a number of cupbearers, the king. But actually it would be a very important role. It's not merely that, there would be other things around it. He'd have a lot of access to the king. And Nehemiah hears word about his homeland. And he thinks, what does Nehemiah do? Does he panic? Does he go into meltdown? Does he do a Roger Burns and go into overdrive like I do? Well, what does it say? He says he sat down and he prayed. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And the rest of this book tells us about what he asks of the king and then what he says he will do. And you'll see the first of the 15,000 bits of paper you received this morning is this one, which is the services for the next couple of months. And you'll see there the heading, Nehemiah Rebuilding for God's Glory, and having a look at what's going on in each of those. We'll look basically a chapter at a time or thereabouts. So do have a look at that. That tells you, this, by the way, tells us what we'll be looking at and in which building, because sometimes we'll be meeting in the church centre next door. But let's dive in now. So if you've not got your Bible open, have a look with me. We're back on page 484. Because as we go through the book of Nehemiah, we'll see that I'd love to have this description of me. Nehemiah was a man of swift, decisive action. I don't think anyone's ever used that of me, swift and decisive. Maybe a bit, I'm not quite sure. A man of swift and decisive action. So verse 4 is actually quite remarkable. So he'd heard that the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, its gates have been burned with fire, verse 3. What does he do? When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted, so went without food, and prayed before the God of heaven. And for an activist person, that's really quite hard to do, isn't it? To stop and to sit down. It shows his priorities about God and other people. See, he would have had a highly responsible job, this cupbearer to the king. He would be in a secure environment in these spacious gardens, the hanging gardens of Babylon. All these things are around him, but he's not preoccupied with himself. You see, Nehemiah wept because he looked out with compassion to the people affected. What does it say? Look back at verse 3. They said to me, so he had a report from his homeland, those who survived the exile, so being chucked out of the land, are back in the province and are in great trouble and disgrace. Great trouble and disgrace. He's concerned about the people that are affected. And his faith is driving him to do something about it. Now, if we wind the clock back to the 18th and 19th century, there were some Christian people who did loads of good for society. Have you ever heard of William Wilberforce? Yeah? Christian guy. What did he do? Gets about abolishing slavery. Have you ever heard of Lord Shaftesbury? Yeah? Lord Shaftesbury. Have you heard of Bernardo? Bernardo's. These people who saw great need, particularly in an industrial revolution where things are being built left, right and centre, but at great cost to people. And they said, we need to do something about this. Care and concern for these people. And they were motivated by their faith in God to do that. This is what Nehemiah was doing. So I guess the question then tumbles out is, do we look out with compassion on our world? And our world starts right, where we live, and then further afield. Do we look out with compassion on our church? Because Jesus did this supremely. He didn't look out and think, oh gosh, this world's all a bit messed up. I better keep my distance. The Bible says, even while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So Jesus did this par excellence. So in this, Nehemiah, it says he sat down before God, and then I said, and then he prays, and he's got this. Can you see in our Bible? It's sort of indented a bit. this is the prayer that he prays. And we'll just skip through this and we'll see that he looks, as it were, in 4 directions. So the first thing he does is he looks up in dependence. In dependence. You see, we're all wired to worship. All of us, every single person, are wired to worship something or someone. And do you know who most people worship? The person in the mirror. That's what we do. We're wired to worship something beyond ourselves. And I think that life starts to go wrong when we just turn it back in on ourselves and say, I just want to worship me. Of course, it doesn't work like that. But we're wired to worship. We're all praying to something. And here, Nehemiah gets the priorities dead right. He says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God. So he's recognizing God's awesomeness. As someone said, God who sits high, but also the God who looks low. He says, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. So the God of heaven has made a covenant, an agreement, or a promise with people. And that's just what you need if you're going to pray to someone. You want to pray to God who's over everything and really understands it and controls it, but also someone that gets it, rather than someone who's just distant and far off. So Nehemiah looks up in dependence, not to twist God's arm, but to reframe the situation. Lord, this is where I find myself. Let me remember, bring to mind who you are. And God says in prayer, remind God who he is, not because he's forgotten, but because we have. And what do we say in the Lord's Prayer? We'll say it later. Our Father who art in heaven, who is in heaven. We remind ourselves who God is, the position he has. And what is Nehemiah doing? He says, it says to pray to God. Verse 6, let your ear be attentive. So it's sort of figurative language of God. Ear be attentive and eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night. So he doesn't just have a little quick one-off prayer. He says he keeps at it in dependence on God. So first he looks up, then he looks in. Not in a navel-gazing kind of way, but in a right way. He looks in what we might call penitence or sorrow. Do you find it easy to confess sins of other people? I'm brilliant at that. That person, the way they drive, oh dear. That person, the way they did this, I can confess other people's sins till the cows come home. I'm absolutely brilliant. I'm a master of it. And I'm really ready to do that as well, particularly with our poor children. You know, yeah, well, look at that. And then I realised, goodness me, what have I done? Who am I? What's going on in here? What is going on? It's easy to confess other people's sins. What does Nehemiah do? Does he say, oh Lord, those people are terrible? Look down halfway through verse 6. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, so he's probably going back a generation, have committed against you. And he doesn't pull any punches here. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We've not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. What a refreshing honesty that is. Do you ever find yourself saying to God or to other people, Lord, I'm sorry, but you don't really understand that. It was difficult. I was pressured. You know, I was in a rush. You know, and we soften things down. Nehemiah just says it straight. He said, we've acted really wickedly towards you, God. And we've not obeyed the command. If you notice, it's not just the sins of commission, doing something, but the sins of omission. We've omitted it. We haven't done something. And he says we've acted because we haven't obeyed these commandments. You see, he tells God everything. God knows it anyway. We can't pull the wool over his eyes. And in some ways, we need to ask that God would show us really the depth of the sin in our own hearts. Have you ever done any hoovering by artificial light? I bet you have. You hoover around, you think like you do that. Lovely hoovering around, you think, I've done a really good job of this. And then what happens the next morning, the sunlight comes in, and you think, goodness, look at the state. Who lives in a place like this? That's why it's called spring cleaning, isn't it? Because the sun comes out and you can see the dirt. But we tend to think it's not that bad. It's the same with our lives, where we do a bit of hoovering around and we say, do you know, it's not too bad. And then the light of God's Spirit shines and says, look at the dark, dirty bits over there. And wonderfully, he doesn't just say, oh, look at all that. You're in a right bother here. You need to get your cleaner in. He says, I will bring it out into the light, expose it. I will forgive it. Confess it to me. And that's why towards the beginning of each service, we come before God and we say, we're sorry. It's a good discipline. We say we're sorry because we want to look in penitence, in sorrow. But it's not to wallow in it. And Nehemiah certainly doesn't, because he's looked up in dependence. He's looked in penitence. And then he looks back with gratitude or with thanks to what God has said and what God has done. You know, politicians, I'm really good at confessing their sins. Have you noticed there's a bit of a gap between what politicians may promise and what they deliver? I don't know whether it's probably just me. I just picked it up occasionally. Have you noticed there's big things that are promised? And then, well, it's tricky, it's difficult, there's no money, we didn't realise it was that bad, it's their fault, we didn't do it. What's said and what's done are often very different. Do you know what? It's not just politicians out there, it can be us as well. But when God says something, he delivers on it. Look down with me at verse, 8 and 9. So Nehemiah is still praying, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, so this is God speaking to the people, if you people are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. This is a loving parent giving clear instructions and boundaries. This isn't God lashing out, saying, this is saying, if you do that, this is the consequence. And that's a loving thing to do. It's profoundly unloving to say to our kids, do whatever you like. Clear boundaries is a good thing. So he says, if you do that, I will scatter you among the nations. Then verse 9, but if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the furthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. So if you're unfaithful, you get scattered. But if you're faithful, I will gather you back. You're not cut off and lost forever. And if you're here this morning thinking, I've just messed up time and time again, does God want me back? Absolutely. He says, I will gather you because I love you. It's a mighty rescue in what God does next. He says, they are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. That wonderful rescue. Do you remember that as we're thinking again about VE Day and wartime? Do you remember the rescue of Dunkirk? Amazing thing. You go in and they scoop all these people out and they rescue them. It's a bit like what God has done for his people there. So what God says and what God's done, he will act to rescue. So Nehemiah in prayer, he looks up in dependence, he looks in penitence, he looks back with gratitude, and finally he looks forward with confidence. We finally get to the actual ask, the content as it were, of the prayer. Look at verse 11. So he's still praying, last bit, Lord, let your ear be attentive, so it's repeating what he said before, to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. This is the ask. Give your servant success today by granting him, that's Nehemiah, favour in the presence of this man. That's what he's asking. So Nehemiah basically says, can you make this man, the king, favourable towards me, because I've got something to ask him? And we'll see what that is next week. See, it's tempting for Nehemiah to rush in and say, there's a problem, I'm going to solve it. He says, no, I want to ask for wisdom and for guidance as I speak to God. I'm so tempted to rush in. I want to solve it. I want to fix it. I don't know if I'm a man of decisive action, but I want to just throw a load of activity at it. You see the way that Nehemiah stops and he prays, he gets the priorities right, and he says, Lord, would you lead and help? And sometimes God says, wait. It's no accident that Jesus had to do waiting for 40 days in the wilderness. Remember that at Lent, before coming to the greatest ministry the world has ever seen. Time to pray alone he had to before he chose his disciples. Jesus did it. Nehemiah did it. Let's pray we will do it. So we'll see next week what Nehemiah asked for, what's he asked the king for, and how the rest of it plays out. And as I said, it's this thing to pop on your fridge or something to remind us what we're doing and when. But for now, we see in Nehemiah this great man, a godly man of prayer. He says, look up in dependence, look in penitence, look back with gratitude, with thanks, and look forward with confidence in God that he will deliver. That's the confidence we have in our great God.